G'day you mob, Pete here, and this is another episode of Aussie English, the number one place for anyone and everyone wanting to learn Australian English. So today I have a Goss episode for you where I sit down with my old man, my father, Ian Smissen, and we talk about the week's news, whether locally down under here in Australia or non-locally overseas in other parts of the world. Okay, and we sometimes also talk about whatever comes to mind, right? If we can think of something interesting to share with you guys related to us or Australia, we also talk about that in the Goss. So these episodes are specifically designed to try and give you content about many different topics where we're obviously speaking in English and there are multiple people having a natural and spontaneous conversation in English. So it is particularly good to improve your listening skills. In order to complement that though, I really recommend that you join the podcast membership or the academy membership at aussieenglish.com.au, where you will get access to the full transcripts of these episodes, the PDFs, the downloads, and you can also use the online PDF reader to read and listen at the same time. Okay, so if you really want to improve your listening skills fast, get the transcript, listen and read at the same time, keep practicing, and that is the quickest way to level up your English. Anyway, I've been rabbiting on a bit. I've been talking a bit. Let's just get into this episode, guys. Smack the bird, and let's get into it. So, news-wise, Dad, what's going on? You got your iPad out?
I have. I've got. It's been a slow news week. Just one of the things that's worth talking about. The big news this week is today is the AFL, Australian Football League Grand Final day, and we are now. Hang on, what is it? 2:38. So we would now be in the throes of the teams warming up and 100,000 people about to stand for the national anthem and then scream and roar for the next 2.5 hours.
So here's the conditional there. We would be.
We would be, yeah.
But,
so
it's
it's an historical year.
Yep.
There's this year, obviously, with COVID, the AFL and most other sporting codes that have not just cancelled have been severely restricted. And so this year, the number of matches played has been reduced, and where they could play was reduced.
And there was a mass exodus, right?
There was a mass exodus out of Melbourne because Melbourne has been on this lockdown for the last 6 months with some changes, subtle changes in restrictions, but we've basically been on lockdown for 6 months. So you couldn't play football in Victoria. So they decided the AFL, decided a few months ago that the final series, regardless of where teams had come from, so typically the way the final series works is there's a final 8, so there's 8 teams in the finals. And without going through the details of how they actually work.
Quarterfinals, semi-finals, and the grand final, right?
Effectively. I mean, they're not quite like that, but because there's a bit of shenanigans going around as to whether you finish in the top 2 and the bottom 2, and top 2 get an advantage that they can lose a game and stay in and so on. So, but that aside, typically the team that finishes higher in the top 8 in any of those finals will host the match at their home ground. That has not been the case this year because all of the Victorian teams that made the finals have been in hubs in New South Wales and Queensland. So they've played their finals in their home finals. Those that have finished higher up on the ladder have been played in Queensland. And the grand final, it was decided about a month or 6 weeks ago that the grand final, which is on today, will be played in Queensland. It has always been played in Melbourne, at the Melbourne Cricket Ground. There's been a couple of occasions in history where it has not been played at the MCG because of construction work that was going on at the MCG.
So how long ago was the last time that it wasn't played at the MCG, if you can remember? Like decades, obviously.
Decades, yeah. There was a grand final that was played at a ground that is no longer in use in Melbourne in the 80s, I think, when the whole northern stand was being redeveloped. And then I think in 1956, which was the year the Olympics were in Melbourne, at the MCG.
You were born.
It was, yeah.
It's when we got colour TV.
I remember it well.
1956.
No, we got TV in 1956. We got colour TV in 1972. So the MCG was in use at the time, in terms of constructing it for the athletics track for the Olympic Games. And so the game got shifted out to Carlton Football Ground, which is no longer in use either. It's just as a training ground now. So yeah, it's certainly been in Melbourne, regardless of which ground they've used, for 120 years. And this is the first year that it's been outside of Melbourne. And it's the first year that it is not on in the afternoon. You know, the ball will have been bounced. The game would have been started at in about 9 minutes' time.
Normally it would be, yeah. Because it was a twilight kind of game, or
it was late afternoon. It would start at 2:50 or so, and it'd finish just after 5 o'clock.
So what's the rationale for having it at night?
Look, the AFL have been pushing to have it at night for a long time. I think mostly because of television rights. You're going to get a bigger audience on television at night than you are in the afternoon. And I think there's always been this belief among some people that the spectacle is improved by being at night. You know, you can have fireworks and the pre-game entertainment, post-game entertainment, all those sort of things, halftime entertainment, where you've got music bands and things playing, can be done with, darkened lighting with spotlights and things on them, rather than just, if you're in a stadium like the MCG, it holds 101,000 people. And if you've got what is effectively a small stage in the middle of that, or on the side of that, depending on where they set it up, of that ground with a band playing, and it's in the middle of the afternoon, you don't get, it's not much of a spectacle, even on television.
It's on the TVs there,
on
right?
TV, it's okay because you've got it closed in. But if you're sitting there watching it, it becomes a bit tedious. So there's always been this push among some members of the AFL executive to go for a night grand final. But there's always been pushback about the tradition is that it was always a Saturday afternoon. Yeah, AFL football, or Australian football, when it was state-based rather than national, was a Saturday afternoon game. Every game was played on a Saturday afternoon. Yeah. So when I was a kid, there were 12 teams in the Victorian Football League, and there were 6 matches on every Saturday afternoon. They would all start at the same time. They'd all end at the same time, to the point where back in the days before electronic scoreboards, and you'd go to the game and the scoreboards were all manual. So there are literally people standing in this giant scoreboard and switching over these sort of white numbers and letters on black plates for the scores and things. So you actually had to buy what is known as the footy record. It's effectively the program to the game. To know which of the letters, because the scoreboards were, the things were, the blocks of these things were so big you couldn't write the names of the teams that were playing in the other games.
Surely you'd work it out.
Well, no, you couldn't, because they would actually just use random letters.
But I mean, from the score, you'd see someone kick a goal
on your own score, yes, but they would maintain the scores by listening to the radio. Yeah, they would maintain the scores of the other games that were going on. So you'd have Team J playing Team K. And, none of the teams begin with J or K. So you'd have to, is that Essendon playing Melbourne? And so on. So all of that has completely changed, obviously, now. And so there was this sort of, all the old diehards, of which I'm partly one. I sit sort of somewhere on the fence, and I'm not sure which side of the fence I fall on, because a lot of games now are played at night during the season. And that was always the pushback as well, to say, we can't have a night grand final because everybody plays during the day. Now more than half the games are at night. In fact, 3/4 of the games this year have been at night, because they've been playing them, because of the COVID restrictions, they've been playing them on Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday sometimes.
Okay. Whereas normally
it would be a Friday, Saturday, Sunday games, and occasionally a Monday game. And so the idea of going to a night grand final is completely new. So this is a bit of history that's happening. We're fortunate in the sense that Queensland now have got such low restrictions for COVID that they can effectively have a full crowd. It's not quite full, but it'll be close to full in the ground. It's 38,000 or something. It's not the 100,000 that didn't get into the ground in Melbourne, but it'll mean that the grand final will feel like a football game. It won't feel like, even on television,
canned cheering.
The canned cheering and so on. But so that's an interesting experience. And the other major sport in Australia has their grand final tomorrow. And
which
that's the National Rugby League.
Do they do that intentionally to not compete with one another?
They have traditionally had their grand final
a week apart, right, normally?
It used to be a week apart, but then they would do that on the Sunday. They'd have the same weekend but do it on a Sunday.
Jesus, these poor dudes who support both.
I know.
Must be getting messed up on both days and just like, this is going to be a rough weekend, which is probably why we need the holiday.
Well,
right?
that was the other thing that I was going to talk about is that another piece of history, and this is, you have to love living in Melbourne. And the people who come from Melbourne, of which I am one, Pete is one.
Evidently.
60.
Although we can't go there currently.
Yeah, we can't go there currently. I lived in Melbourne for over 40-something years and then moved down the coast. But I've worked in Melbourne for a lot of that time anyway. We've had this sort of obsession with sport in this city for as long as it's been.
We have the tennis.
We have the tennis.
Swimming.
We have all sorts of things. The major sporting events in Australia are mostly held in Melbourne. And Melbourne considers itself to be the sporting capital of Australia, if not the world. I would dispute the world. I think Boston is pretty close to the world, but not because of the major events that they hold, just because of the popularity of their various sporting teams. But that aside, Melbourne has always had this thing of being the sporting capital of the world. And we've always had the spring racing carnival, which is horse
races
held at 3 different racetracks around Melbourne over a period of 3 or 4 weeks.
So which are they? We've got Flemington.
Flemington, Moonee Valley and Caulfield. And then there's Sandown, which is the 4th one now, and that holds one meeting just outside what is typically the big spring racing carnival.
We also have the F1.
Yeah, we have
in
the
Melbourne.
One.
That was always irritating because I'd wake up in the morning and you'd hear that.
Yeah, I know.
In the background, like you'd be like, God damn it.
Yeah, and that's 10 kilometres away from where you were living.
Exactly.
I used to work across the road from the track. So
especially if it's a still day.
Oh, yeah.
It would travel for kilometres and kilometres throughout the city. You would just hear
this really loud, high-pitched noise. Yeah. The Melbourne Cup, which is the biggest horse race in Australia, we have a public holiday for that and have had for 150 years.
And what was the reason for bringing that in, just to get people to go there?
I think so, yeah. It was just, we'll give you a holiday for this. We'll make it the
Go spend some money.
Yeah, the big sporting event 100 years ago was the Melbourne Cup. And then the VFL Grand Final was similar, and now the AFL. So the AFL, the Australian Football League, was effectively formed out of the Victorian Football League and then combining teams from other states.
I just had a weird thought. People who became rev heads and got into car racing obviously first cut their teeth on horse racing. You would imagine.
Horse racing.
Because they would have been interested in these people competing with animals, obviously, that go fast. And then once the vehicles came into the early 20th century, they would have been like, all right, let's start racing these things.
It's just a natural human thing, isn't it? That, we want to race each other. If you have 2 kids on the beach, we'll go, I bet you I can beat you to the rocks. And they'll run to there. And then it's, we're on
dads
horses.
Are putting money on it.
Oh, really? Well, I can race you on my horse. And then they get on bikes and they'll race their bikes. And then cars are the same thing. But
you wonder if we're going to keep cars like we do horses for racing in the future when we eventually move past cars. Maybe if we move to just self-driven cars, are we going to get to a point where we're like,
we just sit in we actually just have the self-driven cars. We don't even have a person in them. You just
no one even remembers, because the average person doesn't know how to ride a horse. Yeah. Whereas back in the day, I would imagine that the average person definitely did know how, at least the basics of riding a horse etiquette.
Country people.
And imagine that getting to a point in potentially Noah's kids' lifetime where they won't...
lifetime.
Well, potentially, where they won't be driving around. They won't learn. I mean, already now, who knows how to drive a manual? Who's taught how to drive a manual from the age of 16 today? Because who has a manual?
Exactly.
Unless you've got some sort of expensive sport car. And even then, it's the flappy paddles behind the wheel. Yeah. So it'll be so weird if I lived to that period where people are like... my grandfather would have been around when cars were just starting to take over, and become really popular.
Yeah, well, not many people had cars back in the 1930s.
Yeah.
It was a luxury. But anyway,
back to AFL.
So we have a state, actually it's a Melbourne holiday. It's one of those weird ones where it's a state holiday, but it's only officially a holiday in Melbourne.
Yeah, how does that play out this year?
I know.
Queenslanders are like, come on, guys.
Yeah.
Give us this damn holiday.
But this one was the Melbourne Cup. So we have a holiday, and the joke in Melbourne is, we're the sporting capital of Australia. We're so fanatical about sport that we have a holiday for a horse race. And then about, 10 years ago or so, it was decided that we would also have a holiday the day before the AFL Grand Final. So we need a holiday to prepare for the AFL Grand Final. I'm never quite sure what preparation was required, but They used to have big parades in Melbourne of the two teams that were playing would come over early. They would have their training sessions, and then the day before they would have a big, vehicle parade where they'd be sitting in the back of cars and waving at the crowds. And you get 100,000 people in Melbourne turn up to wave at them going down the street. So we got a public holiday for that. So the irony is, yesterday we had a public holiday in Victoria for a game that is on the next day in another state, but it was still there. So
well, imagine if they'd taken it away.
Well, yeah.
And just said, you don't get it this year, guys. You'd be
bad
like,
luck. Queensland can have it. Yeah.
Did they get anything?
I have no idea. I don't think they did. Yeah. But it's, to be fair, it is one of the designated public holidays that every state has the same number of public holidays. And that just happens to be, two of them in Victoria are based on sporting events. But I don't know any other place in the world that has a public holiday for a sporting event.
Yeah, I don't know enough about, global
Put
holidays.
your comments below.
There's probably one for soccer in Brazil.
I don't know enough about South America.
I would imagine.
Yeah, there may well be.
What was I going to ask? How have the teams adapted? So you've taken, for those of you who don't know AFL too well, although we do have, I guess we've got teams in New South Wales, Queensland, and WA as well as Victoria. We do South Australia too.
South Australia.
We don't have them in Tasmania, the Northern Territory, or ACT. But
there are teams, but they're not in the AFL.
The home of AFL is effectively Melbourne, and you originally had. That's why they're all effectively the inner suburbs. You have Richmond, Essendon, North Melbourne,
there's 11
Melbourne
teams in Victoria.
Yeah.
So.
Exactly. So how have they adapted, having to obviously move to Queensland where the environment is a lot more humid? How has there been, has there been measurable or noticeable differences in their performance at games because they're in a foreign place, they've travelled to get there, they're having to get used to it, the grounds are different, they're not used to it's not their home grounds for 50% of the games or whatever, and they're in a different climate, or it's been negligible?
Well, it was a bizarre one because the first round of the season was played as normal.
Yeah.
And that was early April.
In all their respective locations.
With crowds and whatever. And that's the COVID had already hit, but it had just started to increase. Mm-hmm. And so we didn't have restrictions on who could travel where, and social distancing and those sort of things came in right at that time. So week 2 was played, or round 2 of the competition was played weeks later. And so I think there were there was a lot of people getting injured, and the quality of the game in those first few rounds was quite poor. And I think that was basically because they'd had their pre-season and then effectively had weeks off. The players had weeks off without being able to train, and then they all got moved into these various locations, and that I think would have had a fair amount of sort of personal, family sort of stress on a lot of those players.
A lot of them took their families with them, right?
Eventually they did, but when they first started to move, they didn't, and I'm sure that had an effect on them. But by the time they'd been, the Melbourne teams that had been in Sydney and Brisbane, the Gold Coast, and I think the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, for weeks, by the time they'd been there for weeks, I think they'd acclimatised to the weather, they'd moved their families up and done those sort of things. So, and in fact, the whole AFL moved themselves to Brisbane, the Gold Coast, for the last 5 or 6 weeks of the season, because they knew they were going to have to be there until the end of the season. So.
Well, I guess they kind of done too bad in terms of the Melbourne teams, as Geelong and Richmond in the finals.
Teams are playing there
today.
So, they've managed to survive all of those, and they didn't finish top 2. They were finished 3rd and 4th.
Yep. So they just managed to get into the finals and then beat everyone to it. Far out. So you're looking forward to it? Who are you expecting is going to win tonight?
Look, this is my heart in my head. I hate Richmond.
It's going to be Geelong.
I hate Richmond. And
they're like 50% as bad as Collingwood, right?
Oh, no, I hate Richmond more.
Really?
Yeah, Collingwood, we actually must do an episode on AFL and teams and things. But I'm an Essendon supporter.
We probably need your friend Ralph to come in as well. So there's 2 of you that actually know your
Ralph
footy.
and I'll just be shouting at each other. I'm a supporter of one team who has actually had, for the last 20 years, have been pretty ordinary, and they've had some scandals. And
Essendon.
Essendon Football Club.
I switched on to Essendon. I was a Geelong. In fact, no.
You started off as an Essendon
I was Essendon,
supporter.
then
we
switched
moved
to
down
Geelong.
here near Geelong, and you went to Geelong, and then you switched back.
I
Bad
think
decision.
I switched back beforehand because I remember
Yeah.
being into Geelong when I was in primary school up in Melbourne and telling my friend Daniel, I'm into Geelong. I follow them now. And him just being like, you traitor.
Yeah.
And I think it was Gary Ablett originally that did it. And I liked how who's the best player in the entire league? All right, I go for his team.
And ironically, his son plays his last game today in the grand final.
I hit his son with a water balloon once when we were hanging out as kids.
At Deakin University.
Fighting each other, yeah. So Gary Ablett Jr., sorry about that.
Yeah, 358 games or something. He plays his last one today.
Yeah. He's
yeah,
probably the highest paid player of all time
one
yet?
Of.
Crazy.
So I hate Richmond, and and it's mindless as to why it's a tribal thing as to which clubs you like and don't like, and everybody of course has their own team, and everybody else is rubbish. But I particularly hate Richmond because when I think I was about 9 or 10 years old, actually I might have been a bit older because I think the first time I actually got to go to a football game by myself, just with some friends. I was probably about 12 or 13 years old.
By yourself?
Yeah, well,
Far out.
12 or 13. Got on
Those
the
were the
train,
days.
went to the MCG and got into the game.
Yeah.
And it was Essendon Richmond.
Mm-hmm.
I was probably being a fairly typically obnoxious 12-year-old.
No way, Dad.
Essendon was winning, and so I was probably being even more obnoxious. And this, what at the time I thought was a little old lady, she was probably in her 40s, but who was sitting in front of me and turned around and hit me in the head with her umbrella.
Really?
Yeah.
Jesus.
So either I
Full
was
on.
being really obnoxious or she was just a bitch. But she was a Richmond supporter. And so I've hated Richmond ever since. I've just had this thing about Richmond supporters. So, I'm going for the Geelong. Go Cats.
Far out, yeah. Well, I guess I should probably go for Geelong. I need to get Kel into it. I have to twist her arm and be like, you're a Geelong supporter now.
You've got it. If
we
you
live here.
It's funny, if you live in Melbourne or Victoria, you have to have a team. If you live in South Australia or West Australia, it's the same. I think if you live in New South Wales or Queensland, it's not so much. You're more likely to be an NRL, a rugby league fan, because that's the sort of centre of rugby league is Queensland.
Do you think that's going to homogenise, or do you think there's always going to be these borders in terms of the further north you go, the more people are into rugby, the further south you go, the more people are into footy?
I think that New South Wales is almost, for the next few years, New South Wales is almost going to be this holdout of rugby league.
Because how many teams do they
Queensland
currently have? Just two?
In the AFL,
Swans
Sydney and Greater Western Sydney.
Yeah.
And there's two in Queensland.
Greater Western Sydney. The Giants.
The Giants, yeah. And because the AFL have played so much in Queensland, it's had a lot of press in Queensland. The grand final is there, and I think a lot of people have got on board. And one of their teams, the Brisbane Lions, finished second on the ladder this year. They didn't make the grand final. But they made the preliminary.
They did pretty well.
They did very well. So,
and ironically, 50% of the team originally was from Fitzroy, right?
Well, when it was first started, about 50%. They actually
it was
moved
the Fitzroy Lions,
Football Club
right?
from Melbourne up to Brisbane
because they ran out of funding or didn't have enough money.
Fitzroy
right?
was just falling apart.
Because I remember seeing that when I was
professional.
That would have been when I was probably a young teenager, younger,
no, very young,
very young, was it?
Early 90s.
Because I remember going to the Napier Hotel, the pub where you could get these kangaroo parmesanas.
Yeah,
they were amazing, guys. Yes. They would, instead of chicken, it was a parma. Well, there's a fight for you. What's the slang term for parmigiana?
Yeah.
I think I'd call it a parma.
Parmigiana.
Yeah, parmigiana. So that would be normally chicken breast coated in crumbs with ham and cheese on it with chips and a salad. That was the parma. And if you go to the Napier Hotel, there's name drop for them, they are in Fitzroy. And so every time I went there would be the Fitzroy Lion, all these old posters of people and banners, winning grand finals or whatever it was all over the place, except for the fact that it had been 20 years since they
don't actually exist
there.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. But kangaroo parmigiana was amazing because instead of chicken, it had kangaroo and amazing. Absolutely loved it. But yeah, so AFL, you reckon the Cats are going to win?
Well, it's a heart and head thing. My heart has to say the Cats, but my head says that the Richmond Tigers are more likely to do well.
Well, it's funny because they were doing shithouse for decades.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then they
Terrible.
came back and did they win 2 in a row? Or
This is their third grand final in 4 years.
Far out,
So
yeah, okay.
They'll win. If they win today, it'll be their third win in 4 years.
Yeah, it's so funny how it all shuffles around.
Yeah, so they've been by far the most successful team in the last 4 years.
How have you noticed, finishing up here, how have you noticed the quality of sports, not sportsmanship, sports ability in players change in your lifetime? Because that's a pretty interesting story, isn't it?
Sports ability?
Yeah, in not just AFL, probably all the sports, but I guess the point is I've seen the DVDs that you have of these teams through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s and onwards now. And from my limited understanding of AFL, at least, up until about, I think, the late 70s, 80s, everyone who played in the AFL wasn't their primary thing. It was they had another job somewhere else.
No, it was this 1970s that players started to get paid, a few of them enough that they didn't have to work.
And as a result, there was that watershed moment of, okay, now we just train full time.
And then it took 20 years for it to become fully professional. But look, I think, and if you go back and watch some of the games from the 60s and the 70s, there are a handful of players on each team that had the skills that would match the skills of the players that are playing today.
Yeah.
They simply didn't have the fitness, and there weren't the
And that's not because
playing
they
styles.
couldn't have had it. It was because they didn't have time to
They didn't have time to do it.
achieve it.
And look, I think almost all sports have improved in fitness and strength and diet and all of those sort of things.
Closer to your mouth.
Sorry.
You're all good.
Have improved in fitness and diet and strength and those sort of things. And that's just a general, technology and science has come into sport. But skill is just practice.
Yeah.
And ironically, I think some of the skills of those players back in my childhood was as good, if not better, than the skills now, because their skill in its narrowest sense of being able to mark, as in catch the ball in terms of football, catch the ball, kick the ball, handball it, are less valued now than aerobic athletic ability. Your ability to run 15 kilometres during a game and still be fit enough to keep going at the end of 2 hours.
Yeah.
And it's not just jogging 15 kilometres.
Especially if you're a midfielder, right?
In the sort
Sprints.
of anything between 10 and 100 metre sprints.
Yeah.
And so those players are super fit now.
And this is why you'll see that difference in morphology between AFL players and rugby players. Rugby players would, I would imagine, run nowhere near the distance that AFL players run. But that, as a result, they end up a lot leaner.
Yeah,
and
but
muscular.
Rugby
players
union and
bulky
rugby league are 180-degree sports. You're basically you're opposing the opposition, so you're running into them and they're running into you.
Well, and the whole point is to stop things.
Yeah,
right?
so there's a huge selective advantage for those players on being big and strong.
Yeah,
whereas the selective advantage in AFL is being agile and strong as well, because it's a full contact sport. But there's
those two things playing against one another. If you get too big, people will run circles around you, and if you're too small, you'll can't fight.
Over. But there are still players. There are players playing in the AFL who are 165 centimetres tall.
Yeah,
very short. Not many, but the typical midfielder when I was a kid is somebody who would have been 175 centimetres tall and weighed maybe 70 kilos.
Yeah.
Now your typical midfielder is 190 centimetres tall and weighs 90 kilos.
Yeah.
And they're running faster and they are equally as agile as those players from 30 or 40 years
It's not
ago.
necessarily that the skills have been suddenly, there's been a well of more people and the skills are now way better. It's more that because of the number of people that people can select from, and then the training methods and the fact that they can spend their entire career building this, that they can then, end up with insane talent across the board.
Yeah.
But does that mean that one of the biggest things or some of the biggest variables now are things like playing at home versus playing at another ground, mental health, whether your family's with you or not, and strategy used by the coaches more so than the actual individual's abilities, because across the board, everyone is really, really talented.
Yeah, look, there's an element of that. I think that now there's much more strategy in the game, and the game evolves. The game changes much more quickly than it used to. the game that I grew up watching in the 1960s was effectively the same game as in the 1980s. So 20 or 30 years, the game really didn't change very much. Now, though, it's very different, and it changes almost on a yearly or 2 yearly basis because a coach or their coaching staff in one particular club will come up with a new strategy, a new way of playing, and it'll take a couple of years before somebody works out how to beat that, and therefore a new strategy will come up, and everybody will copy the successful ones, but it doesn't last very long, so it sort of goes around in circles a bit.
Ah, interesting. All right, well, finish up there, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us. Me and Noah, he's here as well, smacking the microphone with his spoon. That was another episode of the Goss. Don't forget, guys, if you want to get access to all of the Goss episodes, the transcripts, the MP3s, the videos, the entire episodes from 1 to, I think we're up to like 40 something now. Yeah, that's it, mate. Just go to aussieenglish.com.au and you can sign up for those. Anyway, I'm Pete, your host. This has been another Aussie English episode. It's a pleasure, and I'll see you soon.